Welcome to the Cynical Developer Live. This is the podcast that helps you improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology, providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. In this 4-part mini-series, we're recording in person at Percona Live Europe 2019 in Amsterdam. In this episode, we're at Percona Live Europe, and we're joined by Matt Yonkovit, and we're here to discuss automation. Is it making our jobs easier, more complicated? Is it making our software better or worse? Matt is Percona's Chief Experience Officer, or CXO, overseeing company strategy and marketing functions, as well as operating as the Chief Storyteller. Before Percona in 2009, Matt worked at MySQL, or MySQL, AB, and Sun Microsystems as a solutions architect, building out and optimizing high-performance, scalable, and always available infrastructure for Fortune 500 and countless other web properties. So welcome to the Cynical Developer, man.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for taking some time out from your very busy schedule, especially running one of these events.
Oh, it's a great time, though. We get really excited about this, and there's a lot of great people here, so I'm really happy to be able to sit down and talk with you and share some of it with you.
Yeah, and this is something that's a little bit different for the Cynical Developer podcast, is that we really focus on probably more the developer software side of it. We've spoken about a few different database technologies and things like that, and coming to something like Percona, it's a refreshing change, and it helps with that other side of the coin that being the software dev, I tend to ignore a little bit.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing, because I think developers and DBAs, they've often felt at odds with one another because they point the finger at each other a lot, right?
Yes.
It's always, oh, it's the database, no, it's the code, and you get this, back and forth finger pointing. But nowadays, with all the automation, with all the DevOps, you're starting to see the crossover between operations and developer, and they have to speak a common language. So you have to understand both sides, and it's an exciting time, but it's also a time when there's a lot of opportunity to learn new things. Yeah,
there definitely is. And walking around and going to some of the events and that over the last 2 days. I've learned a lot more. It's opened my eyes to stuff that I didn't even realize was still a thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Like what? I mean, give me an example.
One thing I've been talking about on Twitter is MySQL or MySQL.
Okay.
And I've not used it for 10 years, 15 years.
Oh, really?
That.
Oh, my.
Yeah, I think when Microsoft brought out SQL Express and it was free, was probably the last time I used MySQL.
Oh, really? Oh,
so,
well, you've missed so much.
Yeah.
You missed so much. I would try and catch you up, but we're time bound here. Yeah, it would take a long time to catch you up on all the great stuff that's out there.
I've been speaking to some of the vendors, and they're talking about, MySQL's doing this, and it backs up this application. Like, how? It doesn't have those features. But it does now.
It is a robust enterprise class database now.
Yeah. And we are doing a recording later in the week with somebody about MySQL. So to all the listeners out there, make sure that you tune in for that one, because we're going to see my naivety to a huge level with that episode. I'm going to learn a lot, and hopefully you will as well.
Yeah.
So today we're not here to talk about my lack of knowledge when it comes to databases, but we're going to talk about automation. Now, automation it's become one of those buzzwords. They seem to be coming thick and fast lately, and it means different things to different people. But what does it mean to you?
Well, it is an overused term for sure, and I think when you're talking about automation, everyone's going to have a slightly different opinion on what it means and what it means to them. But for me, it's really looking at, the tools and the processes that help you scale and make repeatable work automated. So you don't have to do it over and over again. And that's going to make things more efficient, and it's going to be less error prone. It's going to be things that are, built to kind of click and let run in the background. And I think that's where most people can agree on that kind of high level definition, but you're going to get a lot of passionate debate between, different groups on what automation does and where it fits into a DevOps type architecture.
Sure. And I think there's several different aspects depending on where you are in a business as to what automation is to you. Now, as a software dev, to me, automation is normally around continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and continuous testing.
Oh, yes.
but then somebody that's in infrastructure, it's all about infrastructure as code and things like that. So we got a few different little subtopics there to touch on. Now, continuous delivery and deployment are commonplace in businesses, and to the listeners, I'd go as far as to say that if your business is not doing continuous delivery or continuous integration of some sort, then you really need to look at the processes that you use in the business and ask yourself why you're not doing it. But to you, Matt, are there any real reasons why we shouldn't be providing automated delivery of software now?
Well, so it's interesting because it depends on how you define that and how you use it. So I did a tour of customers. So customers who are database infrastructure customers. So I'm going to approach this from an operations perspective.
Sure.
And you know what? I went around and I said, what is the number one problem that you have? And you know what they told me? It's those developers. That's what they said. and it actually really wasn't just the developers. It was actually the developers were pushing code out that they had no visibility to, and they didn't know was properly tested, and they couldn't guarantee that it wouldn't harm or hurt the production environment. And so a lot of this was caused by continuous integration and continuous deployment code, right? So it was continuously deployed.
Sure.
And it's an interesting place because as a DBA and as a sysadmin, you're actually on the receiving end of those automatic deployments. And a lot of times you might not have visibility into what's actually coming down the pipeline.
Yep.
And it just happens. So one day you're running along, all the systems are green, everyone's happy because they got sub-second page load times, it's the world's greatest application, and then at 12:45 p.m. all of a sudden you've got 8-second page loads.
Yep.
And you're like, whoa, what happened? And as an SRE, as a DBA, as someone on the operations side, that's when your panic starts to kick in, right? And so you start to think, okay, how do we solve this? And we need to find what that is. And then a lot of times it's something that's easily fixed or easily could have been avoided. But I think that getting the operations people involved as you go through your different test and cycles is critical, because that's often missed, right? And so one of the downsides of automation in general is it makes it so people get a little more careless. Right. And so instead of just, testing everything that they would normally test, my functional test passed, I was able to run through and there weren't any breaks there. But you don't always think about what's the impact with a production workload. How does this, impact the systems? How does this impact the end user? And so, it's not that the automation is bad. It's the deployment of automation doesn't always see all the different aspects, especially on the operational side, and how it impacts those end users. So I think that CI/CD is incredibly important, and it definitely is what you should be looking at for most of your applications. But I think that as you look at it, you have to include those operational aspects. You have to understand that the testing is a little different, that the testing aspects of what you're doing, they have to cover more than just the functional specs or more than just the automated tests. You have to look at load testing and what the impact is under production load. And I think that's often overmissed.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a couple of points there, which they point a finger at lazy, sloppy developers, because I've worked at companies at either end of that stick where I've gone into a team and they haven't deployed anything for 12 months because they're scared of what's there, because they were like, we'll deploy next week, we'll deploy next week, deploy next week. It's 12 months later, we've got 12 months worth of backlog that hasn't gone out. We don't know if that code still works, we don't know what the implications of it are, and they're like, well, what do we do? And it's a case of, well, just throw it out there and see if it works. If it doesn't, roll back. And then you've got the other end of the stick where you've got the companies that are just, they're all about fail fast and move forward. And yeah, it sounds great, but then the developers are like, I've done that code, run a few unit tests, looks all right. If it breaks, we'll just fix it, push it out. And I think there's a fine line. There's a balance there to be made.
Yeah,
and developers aren't the ones to be making that decision.
Well, and I'm all for making sure we have the proper testing and making sure that we get the latest greatest features in production. And it's really a push by management as well, right? If you think about management, there is no time to wait for the next feature because they want to beat the competition. They want to get the latest greatest out, and so there's always this push for faster and faster and faster, and that's where you cut corners. But I think that, realistically, I am not a fan personally of, testing potentially, application crippling code in production. So I want to make sure whatever we do, we're testing it before we move and before that automation picks it up and deploys it.
Yeah. I think that's a nice place to be, is that you've got your CI/CD, but maybe it's going to a staging environment, and then there's a manual button that just goes, yes, we'll push that.
Well, and even the automate, it's fine as long as there's some, some check that you can say, yes, this has been tested, or this has passed, these other things. And this is where, the lack of some of the load testing and workload replay tools, and I know there's some really expensive enterprise tools out there that you can do this with, but even them don't necessarily replicate the same workload. And coming from the database world, I often see where the database bottlenecks, right? And it's in weird spots. So let me give you this great example. Several years ago, when I was a consultant, went to a company that does automated, or they do testing for like certifications. Like, you're going to be a CPA, an accountant, so you got to get your test done, right? And so they built these testing applications. And in their test suites and in their test environment, everything was perfectly fine. But when they actually went to deploy it for a certain subset of customers, and it was in a very specific niche industry, they had page load times that were like 16, 17 seconds, right? And so this is massively big, right? This is huge. And, it turns out that they actually built nested loops into their code to read from the database and requery the database. So all of their testing and all of their framework, all of the queries that originally came back, they came back sub 100 milliseconds. Page loads were fine when they didn't have load. They didn't have the number of questions that they had out there. But when they got to this niche, they had so many different relationships. All the queries still took sub 100 millisecond. But instead of running 100, which would normally happen, they ran 14,000 per page, right? And so now all of a sudden you've got this problem that no one anticipated, and it caused an entire industry's testing framework to come to its knees, right? And that type of thing happens very often, and it's often not the normal stuff. It's the edge cases, it's the ancillary code, it's the stuff you don't think to test, right?
And I've been in that exact situation. I built a system for a company. It was a customer records management system, and it went through testing. It was fine. The system flew. It was fast. It was better than anything they had. We rolled it out live, and while it was live, the users started picking it up, and they started using it, and it got slower and slower and slower. And I was like, I don't understand this. It's been through load testing and it worked. And it turns out that I was using Entity Framework. And what I was doing, for every call, I was loading Entity Framework's context up. And I think for every page load, there was sort of 30 odd context being loaded. But through all the independent tests, all the integration tests and everything that was there, that didn't happen. It was when you brought everything together and you had a couple of hundred users on it, that's when it started to come to its knees.
Well, here's another interesting example. Are you a gamer? Have you ever done
I used to be. I used to be.
Okay,
I've got kids now, so I don't get a chance anymore.
Well, maybe your kids are gamers, right? And if they ever get one of the new big games that comes out, you might have noticed a trend that the first week, there's often a lot of problems with them. Okay. Yeah. And what's interesting is a lot of those problems are actually caused because of, untested code, but it's not untested in the game. It's not even close to the game, right? It's generally leaderboards, matchmaking, all these different things that don't go through the normal test suites, because when you're building the game, you're investing 4 years, 5 years of your time. You put a lot of time and effort into, making sure that game is bulletproof and that it doesn't cause issues. But then at the last, 6 months, you're starting to add in, I need to put the leaderboard thing, and I need to put the, matchmaking, I need to do this. And they bolt on these things that are untested, and they don't test all the integration together, and then that causes the issue.
Yeah. I've definitely been there on Christmas Day. I think it was one of the Halo games came out.
Oh yeah.
And once you got into a game, it was great, but you'd sit there for hours. Actually, I think it was one of the Call of Duty games.
Oh yes, Call of Duty.
You were sat waiting for the matchmaking, and it just didn't happen for 20-25 minutes, and then eventually, I think it all caved in. But that would be because of that. I think that testing code sort of leads us on to the next question, which is automated testing leading us to be lazy about testing? Is it not taking away something from the manual testers? And surely, like we've just spoken about there, automated testers won't pick up every little thing because they're only as smart as the people that wrote the tests, really. So the question is is it a silver bullet? Really
no, it's not. There is no silver bullet in technology, right? And I think that when you start to look at automated testing, and again, it depends on what you consider automated. If you're just talking unit tests or functional tests, it's not enough, right? And this is especially coming from the operations side, right? And from the operations side, I'm looking at things like load. I'm looking at things that are going to cause me to get paged in the middle of the night and get woken up to to fix something. And that's something that I want to make sure that when we move new code into production or a new application into production, that we know that it's going to survive and that we have a plan to not only scale it but also restore service and go back to the previous version. And those are things that often aren't thought about and are often under tested. And so I think that's really important for us to understand that, when we talk about automated testing, there's some things we can test, there's some things we can't. There's some things that have to be tested differently than just, letting it run through a pipeline test. So I think that there are different nuances there, but you definitely have to have a mix. And I don't think that everything needs to be manual. It just, you have to think outside the box. You have to think about those edge cases. You have to think about that scale on the operational side and how that's going to impact the end user. Yeah.
Now, I've got some ex-colleagues, some friends that were manual testers that they're very shy when it comes to automated testing because they feel like it's taking their job away. But as you pointed out clearly there, it's testing stuff that you can't even manually test. You need this to be automated testing because you're not going to spin up a couple of thousand laptops, get all the software on them, and then bring in 1,000 testers to manually test it all at the same time.
Right. Yeah. It just doesn't make sense. It's just too big of scale, right?
Yeah. So there's always going to be a job for all of them there. And with regards to actually testing that side of it, it sort of brings us into infrastructure. And another big thing that's bandied around at the moment is infrastructure as code. Why is this a good thing? Why should we be building our infrastructure as code?
Well, so I think that part of this around the infrastructure as code, the DevOps type mentality, it's all about starting to think about how you can manage at scale, right? And I think a lot of this has been brought in with kind of the cloud native type push, right? So when we start developing microservices, now we've got thousands of something. So it's they call it the cattle as opposed to pets, right? Yeah. So now we've got so many different microservices, and then the underlying infrastructure that you need to support it. You can't manually manage that. And you need to ensure that every time that you add additional resources, add additional nodes, add additional infrastructure, that it is consistent across the board. Because inconsistency is going to cause you issues. It's going to become a needle in a haystack, and that's going to be something that drives you nuts, and it's going to plague you. So when we talk about infrastructure as a code, really starting to deploy your infrastructure and understand how to automate that through code level and being able to automatically adjust to changing conditions in the application lifecycle is going to be critical. Let's be honest, every application that's deployed into production has its own living, breathing ecosystem. It's its own living, breathing thing. What worked yesterday doesn't necessarily work today. And as that evolution takes place, you need that flexibility to be able to en masse make changes, but also en masse, be able to, add additional resources and remove resources as you need to.
Sure. Taking that infrastructure, put it into code. Do you think that that's more pressure on developers? Because there's so much now for developers to know that does that not reside with the infrastructure team?
It depends. It really depends on the application that you're trying to build and what your goals are. There's different companies that I've seen do it differently. So for instance, some companies might directly in the application, start requesting additional services to be spun up. And typically the application or the operations team behind the scenes is going to be providing the API. They're going to be providing the infrastructure for you to make those calls. Very similar to a cloud provider, right? So a cloud provider provides you with an API. You call the API to add an additional service or to, spin up something in Amazon or, Azure, and then you go. But a lot of other companies control that at the operations side, where you have, DevOps engineers or SREs who, write the code to look for things and look for events to make adjustments to the environment. We're starting to see, issues with the workload. Hey, we hit 100% CPU or 80% CPU. Let's add more nodes. Let's rebalance across, nodes. That type of thing is more and more common. I see that split more often in larger companies, whereas the smaller companies tend to have the developers have more control over that infrastructure, especially with the cloud environment that exists today.
So something a little bit probably close to your heart is automated deployment of databases. Now, of all the automated pieces that are running in a business, automation of database scares me. And I think more than anything, it's fear of the unknown, because I've been victim myself of bad deployments with databases, rolling forward, rolling back. How do you manage that? The best way that I've seen so far, and as we've discussed, I'm a .NET developer, and Microsoft, their entity framework has the roll forward, the migration scripts, and the roll back, and it's all built into that. But even that's still clunky. What's the best approach for database migrations and automation?
So big question.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so big question. I'll give you one of those answers that is a bit nebulous here, because as we're talking about database migrations, a lot of it will depend on the database itself, right? One of the reasons that, for instance, MongoDB has become so popular is because it is schemaless. Right. And so, changing the schema is often the bane of everyone's existence. Right. And that's where most of your migration issues tend to happen. And so having the capability to, have, that kind of document store and to have it be flexible where you can add and remove columns as need be and then not impact, the underlying infrastructure, that's a powerful thing. And that's made it a very popular deployment, location for a lot of applications. It's very popular, especially in the mobile space where you're, exchanging JSON, right? So in the case of that, database migrations become a much less critical operation when you're talking about schema changes. Yeah. Now, when you're talking about MySQL or you're talking about a, relational database like Postgres or even SQL Server, then there are other nuances, there are other, code, and there's been a lot of emphasis, especially from larger vendors like Microsoft or Oracle, to do things like, be able to flash back to a previous, schema or to, roll back changes. Yeah. And in some of the open source space, there are some, tools out there to help with that. Most of them are not shipped directly with the software. So when we start to talk about those migrations, the question is, which database and what, sort of application. A lot of our open source developers have, learned to work around some of these nuances. And so they've developed tricks, tips, and, scripts in order to, kind of help with them as well. But, when we're talking about, like the best way to do migrations, I think, again, when you know which database you're on, your application, what's going to happen, you have to make sure before you start, you have a concrete plan to roll back. You have a concrete, back out plan. You know what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and then you methodically do it. And this is where, the automated testing can sometimes cause problems if you haven't done that. And, if you, kind of think through the process, especially on the bigger changes, that can help you survive that type of thing. But a lot of this is also mitigated by building, the proper schema and the proper architecture up front that is flexible enough to handle some of this.
Sure, yeah. Because the biggest thing that just scared me about it is the loss of data, because I've battled this in the past where, again, it's going to be coming from a SQL Server point of view, is that you get the devs to write their their migration scripts, put them in a folder that's in the repositories. The DBAs come in, review them. Are these good? Yeah, they're fine. Then it comes to release. They do the release of the software, and as that's being deployed, the DBAs are running the scripts, running through them.
Oh, yeah.
And then somebody's put in a script that maybe it added a column, dropped a column, and then it was trying to copy the data across. It didn't do that.
Yeah,
and it failed, and you lost all that.
And again, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because in a bigger enterprise, bigger software, you tend to have those nuances. A lot of software now are running, their own frameworks, whether it's, like if you're running Java, for instance, you guys, you're talking .NET, but in Java, you might use Hibernate, and you might use their methods for doing deployments. If you're using, Ruby on Rails has migration methods, right? And so everybody has their own little migration methods to try and help with those and to try and make sure that they're in sync. And I think that, again, depending on the database, one of the things that we had, and I'm going to say the good old days when I was a consultant, years ago, and now I feel old. We used to often, with mission critical applications that had that type of thing, we would set up what was called a delayed slave, and so we actually had a live system that had all the code in sync, but it was delayed like 30 minutes or an hour.
Sure.
And then if you had to flip back, you could do a really quick flip back to an hour ago with, the data, and then you could sync the data back if you needed to from, the time during that change.
Sure.
So, and then that way you could kind of back things out.
Yeah.
And no matter how careful you are with migrations, though, there's always going to be a bad day.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is where, making sure you have the backups and the recovery methods in place are incredibly important. And you have to make sure that, you've thought through that process and what is acceptable to, roll back to and what isn't. And is there any data loss acceptable? Nowadays, more than any other time in history, there is no downtime, right? You when you're doing these migrations, you're generally doing them live.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
you're not doing them like, back in the old days, you don't have this like, we'll take a maintenance window of 8 hours to do this migration, right? You're doing it live in person.
Yeah.
And that means you got to think through the consequences of that.
Yeah. I had a massive rant on Twitter about this probably a month ago.
Okay.
So a brand of pizza that rhymes with Moninos, that is known worldwide. I was hungry. I thought, I'm going to order me a pizza. And I went to their website, and their website said, down for maintenance.
Yeah.
And you're like, really?
Yeah.
It's just become expected now that these things are available all the time.
Yeah.
And the local pizza place, Domino's, it's not even open early in the morning. Why did they not do it early in the morning? But no, they did it at peak time when people wanted to order, and it was on a Saturday.
Well,
and you think, who made that decision?
Well, but down for maintenance means a lot now, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I mean, I'll give you one of my secret shames. I like a good deal online, right? So Black Friday sales.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the Black Friday sales, right? So I'll scope out. And one of the most annoying things in the world is when you go to Amazon and you find some deal that's one of their lightning deals, and you click the button, and then the dogs come up. I don't know. Have you seen the Amazon dogs? Like it says, "Oops, I'm sorry," and they have the cute dog there to make you feel better. I don't feel better. I feel worse, right? And I think that generally it's that maintenance thing that pops up. It gives you the willies there, but man, it's just scary.
Yeah.
And I think that. That's something that you need to watch out for is, any downtime, right, is going to cause issues, whether it's caused by a maintenance, thing, something that's a migration, or it's, an actual outage. And you need to have the infrastructure and the, everything in place in order to survive that. And that's when a lot of people have moved towards doing migrations in like parallel with a hot standby, right? So what you'll do is, you'll upgrade, half of your cluster, and then fail over to that new half, and then upgrade the second half, right? And so there's rolling upgrades and other things that people have done to try and mitigate some of that. But there is no downtime anymore.
Sure. And we've talked about continuous deployment of the software side of it, sort of ignoring databases and things, and the responsibility of the deployment of the software. It went from the developers to maybe the deployment managers, and they would look after it with the infrastructure guys. Where does the automation of the database lie? Where's the responsibility of that? Is that shifted away from the database team, and is that now with the infrastructure team? Is it a part of their deployment process, or is it still something that they need to be involved with?
Oh no, I think they need to be involved with it. I mean, I don't think that you can really push off any sort of work around the database side of things. I mean, it's a combination, right? It's kind of like you've got database experts. They have to know the database inside and out, so they have to be involved in that. When we're talking about developing automation on the infrastructure side, yeah, you want your sysadmins to work with your DBAs, with your developers, to make sure that everything's covered and it's consistent.
Sure. So one last question, which is playing a little bit of devil's advocate, and just to see where your stance is DevOps just not another cost-cutting exercise for businesses because they get multiple roles in one? Because it's what we used to do years ago. We did everything. You did the infrastructure, you did the testing, and everything. And now it's like, oh yeah, you've got to be DevOps. You've got to be DevOps.
I don't think it is. I mean, I think that the reality is everyone has to wear multiple hats nowadays, anyways, right? I think that DevOps has been around forever, and we just didn't call it DevOps. And I think DevOps is a term that hides a multitude of sins already. So I think that realistically, it's really about making sure that you have someone who is being able to scale your application and run it at scale. And I think that's where the difference between kind of the old school quote unquote DevOps or automation and the new school. Whereas before it was a way to make you more efficient, now it's a way that is a reality of life because of the scale of many of these applications. A lot of our customers, you're talking, tens of thousands of, Docker instances and, tens of thousands of instances of, applications. How do you manage that?
Yeah.
Right. And that is a unique problem that requires someone to understand how to build software to manage that, right? And that's where that automation, that's where that DevOps comes in. So I don't think it's just a way to cut costs. I think it's a way that is a reality of the new way of application development.
Sure. So it's quite a big topic though to go in for a developer to learn all of it. Would you advise them to go in and look at everything, or is it focus on a couple of pieces and do that?
I get advised a lot, but the managers in charge of these groups probably have way more to say. So, but I think for me, I think that from a development perspective, a lot of it depends on where you rely on the stack. I think, most developers aren't going to have to learn the nuances of, the database side completely, but they have to know enough to know, where they are dangerous and where they need help, right? If you look right now at a lot of the outages that are caused in major applications, and you look at the database breaches that happen, it's because you had people who didn't understand the technology that they were deploying and using, and they deployed it incorrectly, or they missed something easy. And generally, they're easy things, right? And there are people who, hey, I don't know the database. I click a button, that database comes up. Great, wonderful. I trust that it's going to happen. You can't trust, you have to understand. So you have to understand what's in your application stack, and you have to know enough to know what you don't know and when to get other people involved.
Yeah. And I think there's a key there. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and they were making a complaint about two people that appeared to know, or they sold themselves as knowing everything, and they were asking stupid questions. Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing that? But these two people were at the very start of their journey, and they were at that point where they didn't know what there was to know, so they thought that they knew everything already.
Yes.
And it's a very, very dangerous place to be in, especially if you're a little bit bold and a little bit bolshy. That attitude can get you into some serious hot water.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But that wraps everything up for us today, and it just leaves me to say thank you for taking time out from the conference, and I won't take up any more of your time. But thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a bunch.
And thank you to everyone out there for listening. You've been listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Matt Yonkovit talking about automation. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.